Hello, and welcome to the Eternal Tournament Series. This is our second round of Losers Bracket play for our Season 3 Invitational. Once again, I am joined by my wonderful co-caster, LocoPojo.
Welcome, welcome.
And, sorry.
No, go ahead.
We are a matchup between Iliac on Felnscar midrange and Waspas on Fire, Time, Shadow, Witching Hour token. We've seen Waspas play this deck before. We saw him play it in last week's Open to reasonable success. I believe he got top 8, if I remember correctly. And this Iliac is on the Felnscar deck that his team has come up with for this tournament that's very biased towards much slower decks.
Yeah, the Statuary Maidens, the Vara, the Fate Touch. We actually just saw this deck in the Losers Bracket a moment ago, or the last round that we played. So yeah, should be very interesting to see how that deck fares against larger setups. This time around, there will not be any Rakano champions to bring it down, so we'll see how it fares against the Fire, Time, Shadow, Witching Hour deck.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that this matchup is probably in the favor of Waspas because Iliac, while he does have some sweepers in Lightning Storm, all of his spot removal is pretty much stone dead. Because all of Waspas's creatures are just tokens. Like, they do not represent a full card. So things like Annihilate and Death Strike and all that stuff is just, and even Torch is just bad. It's not going to be able to convert into a profitable exchange. So maybe he's able to fight the important cards like Obelisk and Vault of Praxis with things like Rain of Frogs. But if he's not able to do that, then he's just going to get run over by all these creatures that he cannot remove profitably.
Yeah, I think effectively hitting one of those artifacts with a Rain of Frogs would be very effective. But of course, you do have about 3 cards that can really generate exceptional value on Waspas' side. On Ilya's side, there's definitely some potential for this deck to pull through based alone on the amount of extra value that you get out of those Varas and other cards. Simply being able to play Feln cards over and over again and simply resurrect for extra card advantage could be very, very beneficial for Ilya in the late game.
Yep. We will move here into game 1 between these two players. And we do see in Iliac's hand, one of the more important things I believe it's going to be in this matchup for him, which is Champion of Cunning. Champion of Cunning is actually going to allow him to just turn the corner and kill Waspas before he has to deal with all of the nonsense tokens. Because if he's just playing a straight control game, his answers aren't going to line up. He's just going to get run over. But the way that they have built this deck actually fuels Champion of Cunning with things like the Feln Stranger to quickly enable it on turn 5 to start turning the corner and killing your opponent.
Being able to play that Feln Stranger early certainly helps out a lot. Ilya has to decide between Feln Stranger or Quarry here. I think Stranger probably will end up being the developmental choice. But after that, it's going to be hard to say where the deck goes from there.
Yeah, I think he just needs to just kind of spin his tires and get up to Champion of Cunning. It's going to be the most important card for him. He just needs to win the game with that. I doubt he'll play it before he has 5 primal threshold for the Aegis, at least, so it doesn't get combusted. But outside of that, he just needs to get to that quick. And he does have a lot of things to do in the meantime. He's going to probably Wisdom of the Elders this turn. He could Rain of Frogs next turn. He's a Statuary Maiden. So Iliac has a lot of business.
He's drawn some of his star cards for this particular setup. Statuary Maiden is especially good against token-based decks. And, of course, if Rain of Frogs can catch either Vault of the Praxis or Obelisk before it's too late, that can be extremely good for Ilya.
Yeah, we do see that Waspas' turn 4 is just a mere Disciple. Usually, there's some situations where they'll be able to get one of the 4-mana artifacts down before Rain of Frogs can hit it and they'll at least retain 1 copy. Although we do see Iliac holding off on the Rain of Frogs, giving Waspas another turn to play one of the important enchantments, which there is Zenith Obelisk. So if Iliac just played the Rain of Frogs last turn, he would have had to not worry about Obelisk for this whole game. And instead, he's just going to hit Torrent of Spiders.
Yeah, I think that's going to be pretty rough. At this point, Rain of Frogs is just adding more tutus to Waspas' pile. So Waspas has a lot of damage to push. Unfortunately, without a way to deal with Statuary Maiden, he's not going to be particularly willing to push it. The ability of Ilya to get those cudgels is really stalling out the board in a way that any other single unit would not.
I mean, there's like a point where you just want to push damage past it, although that Bloodcaster coming down still makes these attacks not great, especially when you're only 1 power away from getting the second side of the obelisk enabled. So we'll probably see a torch here, and it'll blunt the aggression of Wasp Boss, but Iliac can't really crack back just yet. He's too influence on both sides of the Champion of Cunning away from that card being good.
Rain of Frogs, yeah, just a dead card in hand now. Perhaps at some point, Waspas will hold on to something that isn't a power, but it's possible that he won't get an opportunity to play that particular card. So another dead card draw for Ilya, and he needs to get into some cards that can actually allow him to get past these tokens.
Yep. I like Iliac playing out the 5/5 there, even though it doesn't have Aegis. Your Waspas is top decking it, so unlikely has something. And I do also like the alpha attack on the part of Waspas here, because most of these have profitable attacks. He gets through for at least like 9-12 damage, depending upon how Iliac wants to block. So he needs to start getting the game over with. He knows that if this Champion of Chaos gets turned on, the clock back on him is going to be very strong. He can't sit around forever. He's not going to win that way.
Yep. We have lots of different options for Ilya. Obviously, playing the Cudgels will give him blockers that can kill the 3/3s, so there's some significant advantages there. He's looking at a Death Strike on the 4/4, which I'm not sure is as effective as simply playing down a Felm Bloodcaster and equipping up so that you have enough defenders to deal with these larger threats.
There's also a strong argument for quarrying some amount to try and get the power thresholds for both flying and the shadow effect for Champion of Chaos, or Cunning rather. It's because the sooner you enable that, the sooner you can turn the game around. But Iliac is just content to remove one of the 4/4s, put up this brick wall. I mean, Waspas does have a Vault of Praxis in play, so he can draw out of this. He can just, like that, he drew the Scrap Tank, he'll alpha here, lose 3 things, get through a bunch of damage, and actually that is lethal damage. So
yeah, Ilya's play here actually, I think, probably killed him. No, it's I guess either way he would only have been able to get rid of one of those units, so there was no way to prevent lethal damage there. But regardless, it ended up being a quick victory for Waspas, and we're gonna see what ends up getting thrown into the sideboard here. A lot of the spot removal on Ilya's side is being sided out.
Yep. Very clearly, you don't want any of that stuff. Things like Strain to Shadow, Through the Past, the third Rain of Frogs, Ruin, those are the more palatable cards in this matchup. He actually has quite a few of them in blocks like a Harbinger, Thunder Strike Dragon. They're like, he has a lot of cards he could potentially bring in. It'll be interesting to see the numbers that he decides upon. So he definitely has a lot of sideboard to have a better matchup for the Game 2 showdown with Waspas. And on the side of Waspas, is a very similar sideboard to what we saw from him last week. It's very trim, just like four different cards. Just 4 Sabotage, 3 Slow, 4 Annihilate, and 4 Scorpion Wasp. I would just expect mainly the Sabotages and possibly the Slows to come in. Slow is not as good in this deck as it normally is. While I do think it is good, you do need to pressure your opponent in order to make sure they can't cast the cards you slowed. And this deck does apply some amount of pressure, but it's unclear if it provides enough.
Oh, well, as long as you can sort of get into that late game with your Xenon Obelisks and your Vault of the Praxis, the late game of a Praxis tokens deck is extremely strong. So being able to play out those cards, getting yourself to that point is actually really quite relevant. And I think it might end up serving Waspas very well, although not in this particular matchup. In this matchup, you're probably going to want to just continue to push the aggro and basically get underneath the more control-oriented deck, see if you can deal with that.
That's not always going to be a viable option. Waspas was fortunate to have a draw that game where he was able to do that. But there are certainly a lot of draws this deck has that don't really allow you to attack through like a Felm Bloodcaster profitably, for example. But as long as the Sabotages are able to protect the important cards on the side of Waspas from Rain of Frogs, he should be okay to win a late game.
Yep. Being that Rain of Frogs is definitely going to be a very important card in this matchup. If Ilya can hit either Vault of the Praxis or Xenon Obelisk, those are the 2 cards that really allow Waspas to take the game. Like, beyond that, most of the tokens don't do as much in terms of just aggressive damage as you'd really want them to. They're more about, like, drawing those cards and getting to those crucial finishers and card advantage. If Ilya can disable one or both of those cards with Rain of Frogs, that could potentially scarper the deck and make it pretty difficult to get into a better situation.
Although, notably, one of the premier cards of Waspas' deck that helps him win without things like these Obelisk and Vault of Praxis is Witching Hour. Witching Hour is pretty potent against Iliac's deck, and even if Rain of Frogs hits Vault of Praxis and or Xenon Obelisk, Witching Hour could be a very viable way for Waspas to win the game.
Yep, the 4/4 units are pretty relevant. They're not necessarily big enough to get past Champion of Cunning, but if you can load the board enough that you can start just pushing over Ilya's Statuary Maidens, then that's going to be a pretty crucial deal. Of course, not the optimal strategy. It's just you have to deal with them before you can continue in too out of control.
Yeah. And Ilyak has a reasonable hand here. He's just going to kind of spin his tires for the first few turns, do nothing on this turn, maybe Wisdom next turn, play Statuary Maiden. So he doesn't have any interaction for Waspas' important cards that could change in the next turn or two, especially with his Wisdom of Elders if he draws a Raid of Frogs, which he did not. But if Waspas is able to stick a Vault or a Xenobos, just get them out of his hand, out of the way of Raid of Frogs, which he is able to do there, that's a big game for him.
Yeah, Statuary Maiden is the key play here, of course, but whatever Jawaspas ends up doing, we have Vault of the Praxis down, so there is just going to be cards from Jawaspas. Every card that he plays at this point essentially draws him a free one. Marison's Disciple, Assembly Line, Grenadin Drone, there are so many different options that actually allow him to continue to draw cards and push up to those bigger and bigger threats, and that means that Obelisk is probably due at some point soon.
Yeah, and again, Ilyak does not have his Ruins, does not have his Raid of Frogs. He has no way to interact with the token cards. And he will be able to stick this Champion of Cunning, which is one special away from Shadow, which we'll play next turn. So the clock back on Waspas is very real. Like, that is going to be a lot. Although, okay, he's not going to combust it doesn't have two. But yeah, like, the clock that Ilyak is going to be providing on the back end is likely going to negate the card draw that Waspas is getting.
Yep, it's a rough situation for Jawaspas overall, but having that Xenon Obelisk definitely helps a lot. Ilya was really counting on getting that Black Sky Harbinger kill, and if you can actually just clear the board with that, that's a really good way to just sort of push. Now you've got double champions.
This is just lethal. Like, if Jawaspas can't, like, he didn't get a Scorpion Wasp that he possibly signed in or something, he's just dead. This is 18 damage.
Yeah. Yeah, a 2/2 flyer will be popping up with a slight buff there, but Jawaspas has already signaled that he doesn't have the capacity to pop through these Aegises, so Ilya was feeling very, very safe and just playing out the unit and sitting still. From here, this block is interesting. I think it should be right, especially since we know that Jawaspas doesn't have the ability to pop that Aegis, and with a Torch, Ilya...
Although Devour does make it so he goes to 2. We know that the Cudgel's in hand, though, so the Cudgel will still maintain lethal, but almost. Yep. Almost got to stabilize there. And that is, as we talked about, one of Ilyak's most likely ways to victory is Champion of Cunning. Because the Jawaspas' deck is just not well equipped to deal with Champion of Cunning. He can sideboard in Scorpion Wasps, which I assume he did. But if he doesn't have those, he's just going to die.
It's a pretty rough situation if those Champion of Cunnings do manage to get down there and not actually be dealt with. Scorpion Wasp is a imperfect answer on account of the fact that there are cards like Annihilate sometimes in Ilya's deck. I think they've gone out in the sideboard, so there's no particular way to protect champions, but there are just not enough answers to that card. So if Ilya can play them down and also get the influence for them, that's a pretty crucial turnaround.
Yep. We move here quickly into game 3, and I guess most of the time, Ilyak's not going to have both sides of Threshold for the champion online on turn 5 or 6 because he is playing a 3-color deck. He does have a lot of fixing. His deck is heavily biased towards Primal and Shadow. He does have Felon Stranger, so he's going to be able to enable it a large percentage of the time. But usually, Jawaspas encountered it a fully powered Champion of Cunning not coming down to like turn 6, 7.
Yeah, this Felon Bloodcaster on 3 looks like a pretty decent defensive play. I think Ilya's got all he needs to sort of deal with early aggressive tokens, even if Xenon Obelisk comes down. Stray into Shadow is also an excellent pickup. Ilya's hand is looking very strong with the 4 guaranteed power and plenty of stuff to actually play.
I'm not sure if it was a misstep from Ilyak, but by playing the Skycrag dual land, he has precluded himself from playing the Bloodcaster this turn. Maybe he didn't want to, but he took away the option.
It's a bit unfortunate. There's a case to be made for it if you want to play the seat ahead of time or the banner ahead of time, just so that you can get your 4-drop Statuary Maiden, which is such an important card. Oh, Rain of Frogs.
Did you see the Rain of Frogs? Yeah, That's a big deal. It's going to be much, much easier to deal with the threats that Dwaspas is able to put out for the rest of the game. This Stray into Shadow is now like just a sweeper. There's no way for Dwaspas to create creatures bigger than it. So that alone is very big, but this slow to get rid of the Champion of Cunning and remove Iliac's Clock also matters a lot.
I'm not sure if it's going to go for the Champion of Cunning, honestly. There's a chance he might hit Black Sky Harbinger or Stray into Shadow, both of which are cards that heavily counter what Dwaspas has. At this point, Ilya has very, very good answers to the token strategy. Without Xene and Obelisk to make the token strategy larger, I think it's just going to be really tough for Dwaspas to climb out of this game.
Yeah, especially when he has 2 effective sweepers. Black Sky Harbinger kills most things. Now the Obelisk isn't a factor. Stray kills everything. It's definitely like a decent decision between what you wanted to slow between Champion of Cunning, Harbinger, and Stray into Shadow. I think because Stray into Shadow and Harbinger are close enough to the same thing, you want to take the Champion that's providing a unique effect of a lot of pressure. Because you're going to get swept up anyway, regardless of which one you take. So I understand why I did it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense here. It's definitely a good idea to disable the win condition and try to just pull into some cards that can deal with it later when it comes up to 10. But this game might actually go that long. Dwaspas isn't going to be able to create a lot of aggressive strategies, and unless he can figure out a way to deal with Statuary Maiden, Ilya's just going to be slowly pressuring him down.
Yeah, and this is just a pretty bad spot for Dwaspas. If he's able to play like a Vault of Praxis and start to get some value going with that, and then Witching Hour is still actually a pretty good draw at this stage in the game. I don't think it's anywhere near discounted enough, but if he's able to get 2 Witching Hours soon enough, that is certainly a way he can win the game. The first one will get checked by Stray into Shadow, but maybe he can cobble together multiple.
The lack of any sort of relic here is really hurting Dwaspas. The fact that he no longer gets any value out of his tokens and still isn't drawing cards off of cards like Vault of the Praxis means that he's well on the back foot, and it's going to be very, very hard to recover from this point onwards. It looks like Ilya's most likely to take this game unless Dwaspas pulls something extremely good. I can't think of a solid answer that isn't going to get answered back by Black Sky Harbinger or Stray into Shadow.
Yeah, even Witching Hour, he would just stray and all of his creatures live and none of the Dwaspas is doing. He would attack through for lethal. So, yeah, I think that Dwaspas is locked out of the game given what's in his deck.
Well, it's like we said, hitting relics with Rain of Frogs just really disables the ability of this deck to come back or generate that excessive amount of value. Like, all of these cards are basically just super synergistic with the relics, and as a result, it ends up being pretty bad there.
Yep, and we do see Iliac take it there. So Iliac moves on in our tournament here. Unfortunate to see the deck on the Witching Hour deck get knocked out. It's a deck partial to me. I like the deck a lot. It's cool to see people playing it, see people innovating on it. It's it's space that people haven't really explored. Unfortunately, the Felon Scar deck is going to be the one moving on in this tournament.
Yeah, it's definitely a deck that I wanted to see more of, but unfortunately there just wasn't a better answer to that Rain of Frogs, so there wasn't any like redundancy to the key cards in the deck, and Ilya was able to take that game. From there, of course, we're seeing this new brew like actually succeed pretty well. This whole Feln setup, I think it's doing pretty well in the tournament so far, and it's certainly taken Ilya a decent ways inwards.
Yep, and we do have a backup match for you guys between Komodo on Time Justice Primal Midrange and Platypus in the mirror match. I do believe that these players are teammates and are on an exact mirror. I can double check that real quick, but I believe that is the case. So we'll be playing. We're playing just a essential mirror between 2 pretty slow mid-range decks.
Yeah, we have 4 Find the Ways and a Seraph here. So Komodo is not going to be lacking for power, but may be lacking for the ability to effectively play it. Meanwhile, Platypus is looking at a similar amount of power, but no excessive amounts of Find the Way. There's a little bit more gas in Platypus's hand, and that Rain of Frogs could end up being pretty relevant since it can hit Mystic Ascendant and completely disable that.
Yeah,
Komodo.
Mystic Ascendant has to be one of the more important cards in this matchup, I would imagine. And being able to Rain of Frogs that just allows you to just fight like an asymmetrical game. You still have your Mystic Ascendants. You're able to draw cards when a late game they're not. Oh, although, like, I guess he's kind of eyeing over Seraph here. similar thing, similarly as good going along. I think Mystic Ascent's a little bit better, but taking Seraph is not defensible, and that's what he ends up doing.
Yeah, it seems reasonable. Mystic Ascendant is more likely to get an actual trigger off before it gets harsh ruled, but by taking the Seraph out, Platypus can push a lot more damage early. There's just not that much that Komodo can do early on, and it belies some of the randomness of this deck. There's not any capacity for Seraph to just suddenly pull something that could take Platypus out of the running.
Yeah, and we see the Sandstorm Titan come in. Platypus does have a lot of proactivity. Komodo is going to hit this first one with a Vanquish, but there's 2 more coming. He's not able to answer those, but he will be able to get this Mystic Ascendant online in the not too distant future. So this game's going to be pretty close. It's really going to be decided of if Platypus's Sandstorm Titans can actually provide enough pressure, or if Komodo's Mystic Ascendant can provide enough value to snowball.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Platypus kind of has a weak play here with Sandstorm Titan, just because Mystic Ascendant is such a likely play soon. If you play Mystic Ascendant, you can easily block the Sandstorm Titan. You pretty much force out the harsh roll. So Platypus can't really play any more of his cards and push damage here. He's just kind of stuck attacking with that 1/5.
And this is the awkwardness of having harsh roll in like a mid-range creature deck, is you run into these situations where you can't really extend into your own harsh roll. Like, you know that they're going to play things, your only removal spell is harsh roll, and it precludes you from really playing anything else. You're just kind of locked into one creature. And it's not the worst thing in the world. I guess it's like a bad card economy exchange here, because the Mystic Ascendant doesn't really count as a card, and Platypus is spending the Sandstorm Titan the harsh roll, but he's killing one of the most core cards in the matchup, and he's clearing the board. So even though it's bad card economy exchange, it's probably just positive overall.
Yeah, I think Komodo made a slight mistake there in not playing the depleted power off of Find the Way. He wasn't going to play anything for 1 that turn, so... but it looks like he does end up with a way to burn that power, as he plays Great Parliament for 4.
That's a pretty good top deck. And Platypus does has his own Parliament and the Sandstorm Titan. The Sandstorm Titan does get checked by the Vanquish. Maybe the Birds trade, but... So it was a good top deck, but Platypus's hand is a bunch of gas. He still has his Seraphs too, so see how this ends up.
Komodo is the one who needs to pull into a harsh rule now, because Platypus is getting quite far ahead on board. This mirror match is really determined by like when certain cards are played and what kind of importance people lend to them. I think that Eye of Winter is really pretty grand and should force Komodo to overplay into further.
Yeah, Eye of Winter and Harsh Rule play so well together, because Eye of Winter just forces them to play out more cards, and then you just like trap them into a Harsh Rule. We will see the Desert Marshal take out the Seraph, so that is one of the 2 Seraphs answered. The second one still is going to be providing inevitability, not to mention the fact that the Eye of Winter is checking the 4/4, and Komodo's just going to be taking 4 every turn from this other flyer.
Yeah, well, he's going to be taking 7 unless he figures out some way to deal with the Seraph. So, yeah, Platypus can decide to play the Parliament here and just push a little harder into the harsh rule. I'm not sure if that's right. It certainly seems like it's right because it pushes lethal so badly. Komodo does not have a harsh rule, so there's no way for him to easily answer what's going on here.
Yep. I like telling your opponent, just show me harsh rule. Although he does have lethal because of Eye of Winter being very good on the offense. The first creature is still stunned. You get to stun the new creature, attack through, and that will be it. Platypus will be moving on in our tournament, and Komodo is eliminated.
Yeah, it's a pretty good matchup. Very, very strong. And like overall, you see like those big Combrade decks having a lot of fun back and forth. And it's a pity that one of them had to go, but that's what happens when you get matched up against each other, running the same list.
Someone has to win. It has to go one way or the other. It's a cool deck. I like it a lot. It certainly seems well positioned. It's so, like I talked about before, a lot of people are trying to attack all these mid-range slow decks through aggression, like the Arcano Plate decks or Queenbird. The other way to go about it is to go bigger than those decks with things like Great Parliament, Mystic Ascendant, and just build a better deck for the mirror. So that appears to be the plan of this Time Justice Primal deck.
Yeah, definitely a really interesting slow type deck. You get those really excellent Seraphs. You get all of the late game advantage of Mystic Ascendants, just the endless supply of cards, which really ends up making for fun matchups. You tend to have this sort of like end boss feel if you manage to get a Seraph down and you just sort of like get to generate all of those cool units. It's a really fun deck to play. I've always liked the big Combre archetype.
Yeah, it's just it does most things well, and then splashing Primal like at a pretty low cost considering you have access to Find the Way. Gives you access to a lot of powerful things like Eye of Winter, as we saw in that game. Cerso, who's extremely good in combat, especially like in the big Combat mirrors, just attacks through the universe. Crystallize, if you're inclined to go for that. Like the Primal Splash gives you a lot of options that are very good, especially in mid-range mirrors.
It looks like we might have one last backup game. Level 13 David's game 2, is this correct? Versus the Ski J.
Yep. And we are joining them like the pretty well developed game. It's a reasonable board state. I was going to say that level 13 David might run away with the Seraph, or we at least have dueling Seraphs, but the Valkyrie Enforcer comes down, checks the Seraph, and now David's in a pretty rough spot against the other Seraph.
It is a tough position. There's not a lot of pressure on David's side, and Skij's Seraph is unfortunately still active and capable of generating monster amount of threats. When you're both ahead on board and ahead on card advantage due to Seraph, that actually makes it very difficult to come back. David is leading currently, so if he loses this game, he'll have one last chance to come back into the game.
Yep. Unfortunately for David, like there was a pretty bad hit off Seraph for Skij there. So it may buy him a little bit of time to possibly draw out of this, draw Harsh Roll to stabilize things. The 4/4 is doing a reasonable job of holding stuff back. He holds back the other flyer. He can potentially take 4 from this empowered, what is it, District Infantry? That's what we call it, District Infantry. Because it's just going to go back to a 2/2 next turn if he doesn't have another power. So,
yep. I like this double block pretty well here. Obviously, it defends against any sort of like Finest Hour or Fun Combat Trick. But David drawing another power here means that he's probably in trouble.
He still gets another draw step unless Seraph hits like a charge unit or something. But yes, he's certainly he's in bad shape. He's
at least at 11 power, which means that he can play Seraph and activate it if he draws it. But from here, you've got more and more flyers, more and more things just set up on Skij's side. Even if he draws a pretty bomb card, it has to at least defend against flying to keep him from hitting lethal.
Mystic Ascendant's a little weird because his best draw is Harsh Roll, and then you kind of have to Harsh Roll Hero and Mystic Ascendant, but we'll see what this land brings. Parliament, I guess, is also a very good draw, and it is a banner.
It's good that he held on to that banner so that he could activate Mystic Ascendant without having to do anything crazy, but unfortunately, that is going to be game.
Yep, that was game 2, so we will be moving into game 3 shortly. We will see if level 13 David wants to reevaluate some of his sideboard options. We have seen him play this deck earlier in the tournament. It is big Combre splashing red for Rise to the Challenge. He has a bit of a transformative sideboard. He can go low to the ground if he needs to. This doesn't appear to be the matchup where that you'd want to do that. Yeah. His deck looks pretty close to his main deck, but we'll see if he wants to change anything
this time. So he does have his pick of the cards that he wants for these particular matchups. It's just a matter of whether or not those cards will give him enough value and tempo against the deck that's playing a similar loadout.
Yeah, there's certainly draws big Combre can have on the side of Skij that with like Evolving Sandstorm Titan or Valkyrie that are pressuring you enough to kind of punish you for taking the turn off. But in general, I think you're playing Rise the Challenge for matchups like this. Like you're splashing it for this reason, so you can draw your important cards. You could always like see your Iron Thorns more frequently, your Mystic Ascendants, your Sandstorm, whatever you want to have, your Seraph. So he's going to have the top end cards more often. It's just a matter of whether or not he lives to that point.
Yeah, they can also get silenced. There's a lot of ways for each of these decks to deal with each other's threats. You have Vanquish, you have Valkyrie Enforcers, you have Desert Marshals. Most of the cards that you're going to pull off of Rise to the Challenge often won't really end up getting a lot of value, but there are some cases, in particular, the sort of the Sky King at the top, where getting a Rise can really pick you up something important for the matchup.
Yeah, we see both players deciding on hands here. David has a reasonable one, so does Skij. Skij's a little bit more proactive, although like David is as well if he wants to run out some of these Valkyries as 3/3 flyers. So both players will be doing stuff relatively early on, and we will see if one of them is able to run away with this. But it doesn't look like it.
David at least has 3 different cards that are 3 drops, so plenty of different options to play early. Seraph is certainly going to be one of the good choices, but it's really a matter of whether or not you're trying to set up the tempo or defend yourself against whatever Skij is playing.
Yeah, and I don't think you need. It's interesting. I think you want to play one of these 3 drops. I'm unsure whether or not you want to like risk a Seraph or just play Valkyrie. You want to have some kind of board. Although the Valkyrie's removal is important, so it's possible you just play the Seraph. If they have an answer for it, they're probably just going to have the answer for it later too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the only reason you play the Valkyrie Enforcer first is if you're trying to bait a Valkyrie Enforcer of Skis. If you can actually get rid of one of those, then it into a situation where the Seraph is better just because you get to play it later in the game.
Yeah, definitely. And looking at level 13 David does have stand togethers. I wasn't sure if the Skij hat was the only one who had stand togethers in this matchup because it is a very important card. Because you want to try and get ahead of your opponent, and then harsh rule is the way to stabilize that on both sides.
Yeah,
and then the answer to that is stand together. And now both players do have stand togethers, so
and it's a crucial card here because, of course, if you stand together a harsh rule in a mid-range matchup like this, then you're the one who's left with units, and that's usually enough to just win you the game. Because your opponent took a turn off, and then he lost all of his units, and then you didn't lose any of yours. And if you were already ahead on board, that's a huge problem that usually just means the game is turned.
Yeah, I wonder if it's actually correct in these matchups, knowing if your opponent will hit. If your opponent has like 3 stand togethers, if you just side out harsh rule, because I have to imagine the game would get to a point where you would frequently just never be able to play it because if they have the stand together, you just lose in the spot. So I'd be interested to see if like this matchup ever evolves to that point where people would just kind of level their opponent and side out harsh rule in the favor of more proactivity to prevent them from ever getting behind in the first place.
There's certainly a case for it. Mid-range decks can, of course, run over each other if they manage to get enough of their big threats out. The main problem is that there's not that many things you can side into get that continued advantage. Like almost all of the big stuff in the Combre deck is already in the deck. Seraph and Mystic Ascendant, the things that generate basically the infinite advantage that you need to push through another mid-range deck are pretty much always 4-ofs.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Maybe something like Carnosaur that we're going to probably see here is the answer. I do like Predatory Carnosaur.
Amazing in this matchup. It kills Sandstorm Titans just dead. It manages to develop the board. It basically automatically prompts a harsh rule or die situation. And that kind of amount of pressure is really, really strong.
Yeah, and we do see that Skij being a little bit more conservative, just playing out his Seraph with stand together protection. We see David playing similarly. We will see if, because Skij has 2 stand together, whether or not he wants to protect the Seraph from silence here. I do think you probably do want to do that, and we do see him pull the trigger.
He'll be able to use Seraph's ability pretty much guaranteed. There's not that many ways that David can now crack through the Seraph. He could play his own Seraph, but that just sort of prompts basically a Valkyrie Enforcer on Skij's side. So this puts him in kind of a tough position where Skij now has a similar amount of tempo, and David probably just has to cast Stand Together if he wants to continue the aggression.
Yeah, you saw him debating there whether he just wants to play Stand Together to lay the beats. He decides the 1 damage isn't worth it. He'd rather hold it back. I'm inclined to agree that 1 damage isn't worth giving up the Stand Together at sorcery speed. So we will see whether or not he wants to leave up Stand Together or just play out the Seraph. I think that it's whoever gets up to like activating the Seraph first is probably going to win it. It looks like that's going to be Skij.
Of play, but the one where you play Seraph is really just kind of the worst one. I think that while there's some merit to the aggressive play of playing the Stand Together early, the safer play, of course, is to just go for Seraph and keep the Stand Together up to protect yourself so that you can counter Skij's Seraph activations with your own. It's going to be tough either way because Skij is just a turn ahead here. He basically went first, so there's not too much that David can do to prevent all of Seraph's activations from hitting him a turn early.
We do see Skij deciding whether or not he wants to extend out into a potential harsh rule. He can just Mystic Ascend and draw a card here, but then if David was to have harsh rule on the back end, he loses both his Seraph and his Mystic Ascend, and that's all of his inevitability. He just has a Predatory Carnosaur left, which is a reactive card. So there's definitely he could get blown out if he plays the Mystic Ascend. Of course, we can see that it's going to be good for him, and he does end up going with it. But there's certainly a downside to this if David rips a harsh rule.
Yep. Overall, like I think it's a pretty sound play. Mystic Ascendant is always going to at least replace itself. The
Oh,
harsh rule
and there
does
it
come
is.
down. Yeah, that's a pretty impressive hit. At this point, David can now swing for 6 on harsh rule, or he can try to play Seraph down,
I
which I
can't
don't
imagine.
think is
You have to take a like that's Seraph and Mystic Ascendant are like two most important cards in the matchup. You get to trade 2 Valkyries and a harsh roll for them, and you still have your own Seraph protected by Stand Together. Like that just has to be correct.
Yeah, it's pretty rough. From here, Mystic Ascendant is obviously drawing cards. Like if he allows the Seraph and the Mystic Ascendant to live for another turn, it's almost guaranteed that both Mystic Ascendant will draw a card and Seraph will activate and create a new unit. There is a case to be made for this sort of like 8 damage, just try to swing for a lethal option, but if any of the cards that pull off of Seraph or Mystic Ascendant have flying, the harsh rule is forced anyways, and he loses the Seraph that he's
Yeah,
about to play.
I would like the Stand Together play if it was a 2-turn clock, but it's not. It's one short of a 2-turn clock. So given that, so he's gonna Stand Together, attack for 8 here, and then what? I guess he is lethal in 3 turns. But your opponent gets to see so much between then and now.
Still quite possible that this is a good play for David. If there are cards that he can pull that allow him to push that Seraph through, basically anything that allows him to just push a little bit of extra damage, it could end up being very good for him. And I think David is sort of aware that at the moment, the Skij has more card advantage than he's currently packing. So if he plays this game out into the long game, that might not serve him very well either. This could be his last chance.
Yeah, I would we're likely going to see the predatory card store here. You could spin the wheel on Seraph, but you really want to deal with one of these flyers. I mean, again, it's not lethal. With the 2 flyers, you would go to 1, but I think Carnosaur is the safer option. It's got to be better than the average Seraph hit.
Yep. That may end up forcing the harsh rule. He does go for the Seraph. So David's going to reduce Skij to 1 and then harsh rule. And I think that's actually pretty good for him overall.
I think it's a good follow-up.
Yeah, it's pretty strong. The main issue here is that he's going to take 2 from that Temple student, and there's not really anything that he can do about the Temple Scribe.
Yeah, little Temple Scribe hanging around. And yeah, Skij, of course, the downside of that Carnosaur, which he was kind of priced into playing, was he had to leave down Stand Together. So we will see a Sandstorm Titan, which is a really good draw here. Going to provide a lot of pressure. Although the Mystic Ascent is going to be a 6/6, but Sandstorm Titan, yeah, Sandstorm is going to be a 6/7.
Sandstorm Titan is pretty close to lethal at this point. Mystic Ascendant has to draw another unit, and if it doesn't, then Temple Scribe just finishes.
And even if he does draw something to deal with the Scribe, the Titan still is lethal. So,
And there's that Rise missing the beat. Yeah, real unfortunate. Just it ends up being a weird card in this matchup because you just lose that tempo at certain places, and with some of these decks, you can't miss a step against them.
Yeah, that was interesting. I think I kind of too readily discounted the aggressive line on the side of David. I think it didn't work out in the end, but I do think it was actually more viable than I give it credit for, because essentially the only thing you're giving up by waiting a turn on the harsh rule is the card for Mystic Ascendant. Because if the Seraph activates, whatever it gets, you first kill with harsh rule anyway. So yep. I think that the cost was actually lower than I was making it out to be, and I think that was probably the better play.
Yeah, the Temple Scribe with Aegis made it a little bit iffy because there was that potential to just like get pushed down and get into a situation where when you're top decking, you're just as close to lethal damage as they are. And that's what ended up happening. But I think overall that does just give him a more aggressive strategy, and he can do things like rise to the challenge for Stone Scar Maul. He actually has some options that will push across the remaining damage that he needs to win the game. So yeah, it was a really cool play. It's a shame that it didn't work out, but that's going to happen. And certainly I think both players played excellently this time around.
Yeah, we'll be seeing Skij in later rounds. In the future rounds of the loser bracket. Unfortunately, we've seen the last level 13 David for today, because this is the losers bracket. This is double elimination tournament. We will be taking a break shortly to move to I think next round is the winners bracket. So we will see the winners next round. So the people who just played will be taking a bit of a break, but we will be back with that round shortly. All the other matches are finished. So for LocoPojo and everyone else here, I'm Truedawn, and we will see you very soon.
See you soon.